Welcome everyone to Middle Ground Book Fest. Today's panel features amazing fantasy writers. Before we get to know them, I'll introduce myself. I'm the moderator, Alexis Ennis. I'm Mrs. Book Dragon on Twitter and Instagram, and I am a sixth grade reading teacher, avid reader, kind of obsessive, and part of the YouTube channel Legit Kid Lit, where we interview authors with my partner Tiffany. So let's go ahead and get to our wonderful authors. I would like each of you to share 3 things that you must have when you write. Let's start with Alysa Wishingrad.
3 things that I must have when I write: a good cup of tea. I must have Scrivener open, and I must have a lot of patience to sit, because on the days that the words are not coming, I can't just get up and walk away. I have to find my center and just keep plowing.
Thank you. Alyssa Coleman, what do you have to have when you write?
I have gotten to be a pretty flexible writer lately, having to write in different locations and settings, but 3 things I have to have. I have to have the internet off. I turn my Wi-Fi off when I write so I don't get distracted. I have to have a beverage because I try to eliminate excuses to get up and walk away from my desk, because the fastest way to get work done is just stay and get work done. And I have to have either a good chair or a good place to stand.
Those are all really good. What about you, Kaela Rivera?
I have to have a place where I can get nice and comfy. Like, I have terrible posture, but I love to like curl up and be like, nestle in, you know? So it's got to be somewhere that I can do that. I have to have 2 Word documents open. So one of them is where I dump everything, where I'm like, oh, I wrote this whole scene. No, that shouldn't be in here. And I just move everything as I write. And also keep it just in case I change my mind and I'm like, oh, actually, yeah, now I'm going to put it back. And always a big, big glass of water. Like, the bigger the glass of water, the better, because I agree with Alyssa, staying hydrated is important, and not having to get up to stay hydrated is important so that you can stay focused.
That's awesome. What about you, Gail?
So I also use Scrivener like Alyssa. It's the best word processor. And like Kaela, I also have 2 documents open, one for the actual story and one for the scene dump for plot. I also need a thesaurus, so I don't use the same word too many times. And I need my trusty notebook just to jot down characters and keep track of things.
Does anybody else handwrite as well, or do most of you type? Handwrite?
I do. I think
don't handwrite, but I do take little notes sometimes to make sure, just visually, it's a bit easier.
That's interesting. All right, and Shakirah Bourne, what about you?
Oh, well, I need silence to write. I am the type of person, if there's any type of music playing, I actually get up and dance and sing. And so no writing would be done. So I actually need silence. I do need a million tabs open. Unlike Alyssa, I need the internet. I always have questions when I'm writing, and so it's like a quick Google search constantly. So I have a million tabs open. And believe it or not, I need an empty stomach to write because when I'm full, I want to sleep. So I'm not productive at all. So I can eat fruit, I can drink water, but if I have a meal, my productivity just plummets.
That's perfect.
I love how well you know yourselves as writers. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. So let's get into your book. So let's start with Shakirah Bourne. You wrote Josephine Against the Sea. Can you describe that book? Oh, look at that cover. It's so gorgeous. And the book, the world that it was set in.
Okay, so Josephine Against the Sea is a contemporary fantasy that is set in my island, Barbados. It's about 11-year-old cricketer Josephine, who is really overprotective of her dad. And so she creates booby traps to scare all his dates away. And these tricks work until Maurice enters her life and she figures out that Maurice may not be human. And so she has to convince everyone of Maurice's true identity before she loses her dad forever. And yeah, it's set in Barbados. So, you know, it's my life, it's my lived experience, it's my traditions and beliefs. But, you know, a lot of freaky stuff happens.
Lots of freaky stuff. Sounds wonderful. Gail Schmidt, you wrote The Dreamweavers and No Ordinary Things. So can you look at that? They both look beautiful. Would you like to share the worlds that they're in, or one of them?
Yeah, so my upcoming book, The Dreamweavers, it takes place in ancient China, and it follows two twins whose village falls under a mysterious curse, and their grandpa gets arrested and blamed for it. So it's up to the twins, who are complete opposites, to journey together to the imperial palace in order to solve the mystery behind the curse and save their village and clear their grandpa's name.
Wow. You know, I teach social studies as well. I do ancient cultures. And so these books are going to come in handy whenever I'm teaching these. All right. Kaela Rivera, you have Cece Rios in the Desert of Souls. Can you tell us about that world?
Yes. So Cece Rios in the Desert of Souls takes place in sort of a alternate fantasy version of Mexico, like northern Mexico. And it's roughly like time period is like roughly based on the 1930s, because a lot of the inspiration for the story came from stories my abuelo told of growing up in 1930s Mexico. Like stories about making adobe, like watching his parent and his tios, his uncles and stuff, making his adobe house and like on the ranchero and like taking goats out across the desert and stuff like that. I just loved it so much. I was like, I have to write a book based here. So I was really excited when that turned into Cece Rios in the Desert of Souls. Of course, it really leans heavy into Mexican folklore and legend as well as just Latinx legends and folklore as well, where the criaturas, which are different legendary creatures, haunt the desert, and Cece gets to know them pretty intimately as she tries to go rescue her sister.
Nicely said. Yeah. All right. So what about Alyssa Coleman, author of The Gilded Girl? Can you let us know about that world?
Sure. I wrote The Gilded Girl. My book is set in an alternate Gilded Age New York. So you can tell by the cover, there's some different, you know, that's not a contemporary outfit that they have on there. But in this world, magic is a privilege of the rich, and only the rich, while every child is born with magic, only the rich can afford the education they need in order to kindle it into lasting magic. Anyone who can't afford that education sees their magic snuff out before they turn 13. So in this book, I have a girl who is born from privilege, who loses her access to magic when her father dies, leaving her penniless. So she becomes a servant, and the two servant girls then work together to challenge this system and keep their magic.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Alysa Wishingrad, you wrote Verdigris Pawn. Why don't you tell us about that world?
I did. The Verdigris Pawn takes place in a quasi-medieval time period. So I drew on a lot of research of pre-industrial times and lifestyles to build the world. This is the story of Beau, who is born heir to a terribly despotic ruler of the land. Beau has been raised in a gilded cage. He has no idea about the truth of what goes on in the land. In his name, all he knows is what he learns in the histories that he's made to study day in and day out, until he meets a servant girl with a very hidden and very special talent who opens his eyes to the truth about what goes on in the world. And Beau sets off on an adventure to find a hero, somebody who can set things right. But along the way, he learns that, you know, not everything and everyone is what they seem to be. It also centers around a very chess-like game that's been outlawed in the land called Fist, and that's where the title comes from. this very important and pivotal game piece called the verdigris pawn.
Well, thank you all for sharing. Those all sound so fantastic. I want to get into some of the ways that you came up with and developed your stories. So, what are some of the resources you used to sculpt the choices you made when building your fantasy world? And let's start with Kaela Rivera this time.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, my abuelo was probably the #1 resource. I took notes when he was telling me stories. You know, I didn't even do it at first because I was going to write a story about it. I was just taking notes because I wanted to make sure that it lasted, this family history. And like just so many amazing stories and like emotional experiences in the way he described where he grew up. And then I became more fascinated especially as I started to be like, wait, what if I set a book here? And I got very excited. And then I had to hunt the internet down and like search for books, which was really hard, by the way, centered in that time period, like 1930s Mexico. Like nobody talks about it, you know, except the Mexican Revolution, which is also important, but wasn't quite what I was looking for. You know, I was like, what about all the other stuff that was also happening? And like researching that became very difficult. Like Mexican clothing is probably the thing I ended up spending the most time researching. I was like hunting down, what is it called though? The pants, what are they called? What did they wear? Charro pants is one of them, by the way. Which is what like the modern mariachi outfit is based on, but it didn't look as flashy then as it does now because it became a celebration of like the charro pants are the only thing that like poor Mexicans were allowed to wear because you couldn't wear clothes that were fancier because that's for the Spanish people, you know? So it's actually a really interesting history of like the workman's clothes that became like the celebration of the mariachi outfit. But they were, you know, again, not quite as flashy then. Couldn't really afford that. But I spent so much time researching that and like going into and like making sure I understood the geology of Mexico because it became very relevant in the story. Like is so hyper specific and it does sculpt the story, but in ways that don't usually matter to the reader. But I had to know that, yes, there is sandstone here. And, and yes, these are the kinds of things that they mine. This is where fire opal comes from and things like that. Like I now know that fire opal is created in the base of volcanoes. And that's why it comes in, like there's lots of them in Mexico. So a lot of the, like the very, quiet background things are the things I ended up spending the longest having to research. Like, because I had my abuelo for some of the more obvious things, like, yeah, adobe houses, this is what the streets look like, this is what the desert look like, the cerros, you know, things like that.
Wow, a lot of intense research. I like that. So what about you, Gail?
So the Dreamweavers takes place in ancient China, and I'm Chinese American, so I drew on a lot of the Chinese mythology I learned as a child from my grandparents and from my parents. And for example, there's the mystical jade rabbit, which is a rabbit in Chinese folklore that lives on the moon, and it's spoiler alerts right here. Also, there's references to the Monkey King, which is also another popular mystical figure. So the Dreamweavers, you can probably tell from the title, it has the dream component. And one thing that's popular in traditional Chinese folklore is it's popular for the characters to go from the real world to the dream world. So that's an aspect I also put in the book. In terms of research, I did some research on how life was in the Ming Dynasty in ancient China, and I also looked a little into the Imperial Palace, but it was more, I think it was more of a fantasy, so I used those to inform the setting.
I like this blend of research and fantasy that we've got going on. What about you, Shakirah?
So my process was very similar to Kaela's. Barbados has an oral tradition of storytelling. In the Caribbean is very popular as well. So our aunties and our grandparents and grandmas would just tell us stories and tell us things that they would have heard growing up. Like, I heard, if you're alone at night and you hear rocks on your roof, it means that a steel donkey is outside throwing stones and someone has put a curse on you. And a steel donkey is this cursed animal with eyes like fire. So it's a mixture of not personal experience. I didn't have an experience of a steel donkey, but I have stories where my aunties, they do strange things like to ward off evil spirits. Like one time I borrowed someone's bag and there were black-eyed peas at the bottom of the bag, and I couldn't figure out why they had peas there. And then when I asked, she was like, "Oh, leave my peas alone. They ward off evil spirits." So all of that went in my book because these are things that people just live. These are people's lived experiences that they just don't think to write down. There's not many opportunities to write down. And in terms of other research, apart from like personal experiences and stories I heard growing up, a lot of it was scouring the internet for information about these characters, because we know what there are, and like we know different manifestations, and I found out that a lot of them are rooted in African mythology, but no one knows how to stop the creatures. Like no one is telling you how you can get away alive. So it was so hard that I actually wrote in the book where my character is trying her best to find information about this character, and she's just coming up with nothing, and she has to interview people. And in real life, I think it was like the last maybe 2 drafts before publications, I finally found information from an aunt about how you supposedly stop a creature, which by the way is taking off your slipper and walking into your house backward. I don't know if it works, but this information is so hard to find that I made it part of the story. And so that is why I love it. It's a mixture of personal experience, it's a mixture of stories I heard growing up, and then just pure fiction, because I had to, my character had to live in the end. So I had to give her some kind of ammunition.
Very awesome. What about you, Alysa Wishingrad?
For me, it was a lot of, like Kaela, a lot of digging in to find out, what were the clothes like? What did people eat? What did the world smell like? What did it sound like? And I found this amazing file of somebody had recreated what a street in Paris in like 1500s would have sounded like. I mean, they had built it on research, but just sort of sitting there and immersing yourself in all the different sounds that you would hear in addition to the wagons and the birds and the voices. You might hear a shoveling sound as somebody is, scooping out coal or whatever it was. It was fascinating. So I love getting lost in that kind of immersion. And then the other kind of research that I did for Pawn was a lot of reading of history and reading about despots and how they control the population and how they work and how they come to power and how they stay in power and how they are removed from power. And a lot of times it is a crisis that's out of their control, that they cannot contain. And so that's where the sort of fever storyline in Pawn comes in. But yeah, I could go down research rabbit holes for days and days, just trying to figure out, what would a jerkin for a working class person been woven out of? What color would it have been? It's just love that stuff. And half of it doesn't even make it into the book, And
Alyssa Coleman, what about you?
Like the other Alyssa, I also love doing research, and sometimes I have to remind myself to stop doing research and start writing. But with my book being set in 1906, it features a historical event, the San Francisco earthquake, even though it's a fantasy world. So I did a lot of research. I cannot stress how wonderful my local library was. I reached out to the librarians. They helped me find resources. Using the subscriptions available through the library, I read newspapers from the day of the earthquake and the subsequent days after to find out when did certain parts of the news start to break, how long did it take before they started to know how many people had died in the earthquake and all of that information. And that helped build my timeline for the story. I did a lot of research and looking at pictures. But one of my favorite things to do when I'm building a book for middle grade readers is to look at the resources that are available about my time period for the audience that I'm writing for. So I spent a lot of time on Khan Academy. I read a lot of books that are centered towards middle grade and high school readers to see what facts I always figure that my readers are going to go try to fact check me. The things I'm going to get called out on, it's not going to be on by the adults or the parents. It's going to be the readers. So I like to see what is available to them and what they're going to find when they try to fact check me. And that's actually where I usually start my research and build from there.
That's brilliant to use Khan Academy. I would have never thought.
It's like making a mental note about that.
It's really wonderful, and it really helps. It gave me a great foundation to start when I was just getting my feet wet in it.
Yeah, and to really know your readers and what they know. So that is brilliant. All of your research just makes those books so much more powerful and important. I thank you all for sharing that. I know some of you shared personal experiences and heritage that inspired your books. Does anybody else have any personal experiences that helped motivate, or do you want to add to how they developed your books and your world?
I'll say just briefly, some of the, there's a whole thing about brujas and curanderas in my book, which is those are both real things in Mexico, in Mexican American culture and things like that. And a lot of people haven't heard of curanderas specifically, or brujas actually, but but I brought that in because my abuelo has stories of encountering both in his lifetime. And he told me about how curanderas helped heal his mother after she was cursed by a bruja because they wouldn't sell her a goat. And I don't know why they wouldn't sell her a goat, but she was pretty mad about it apparently. So I wanted to bring in some of that mixture of real life experience as well as superstition and just that experience and bring it in. And then of course, translate it to my fantasy thing because they do act differently in my world. They have the same names and they have similar roles, but they do act differently in my world. I guess that's where you can say I leaned into the fantasy, my fantasy.
There's a scene where two of my main characters, Bo and Nate, wind up at a gathering, which is sort of a in the book, it's an outlawed gathering of the peasantry, and there's a scene where they have something like a Burning Man, a wicker man, which is an old tradition for people to sort of give over their woes, their complaints. You would write it down, or you would put something inside to symbolize what your woes and your problems were, and then you ignite it and release those problems to the gods and to the cosmos. And that was something that I really wanted to bring to life. How the peasantry, they're the peasantry in my world, dealt with the relentless repression that they were forced to. What practices did they embrace to find relief from the day-to-day trauma of being completely repressed?
I have kind of an unusual answer to this question, which is the idea of the book and the separation of the classes really came from a personal experience that I had in a conversation with my mom. My mom's a high school guidance counselor in a very split area where there's some very wealthy students, and then there's other students who, if they graduate from high school, might be the first from their families to graduate. So she sees this very, as she's helping these students through their college admission process, she sees very different experiences, very different family attitudes toward it. And she and I were talking about it, and she said something that really kind of stuck with me, which was that education is the biggest barrier to class mobility in the United States today. And I started thinking about that, and I knew it just resonated with me so much, and I really wanted to dig into that. So the class divide and the way that kindling requires education in my book really came out of that conversation. So even though it's a historical book, that was my personal experience that shaped the whole novel.
Anybody else have anything to add?
Well, on a lighter note, I was very mischievous when I was younger. And so I always scared my little sister and my cousins. I was always making up scary stories. So, Josephine does create a lot of booby traps for her dad's dates. And not that I have ever, put a bucket of slime and dumped it on someone, but I really did some very complicated pranks and booby traps when I was younger. And to this day, my sister still talks about how I made her think that a baby lived under the bed and she was trapped there, and you had to give these magical words, and then I pretended to be trapped under the bed, and I could hear her like trying to practice the magic words from on top. So I feel really bad, a little bit bad, no, but definitely Josephine's urge to create these pranks came from myself and my own personal experiences with my family.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, so in the book, the twins are very close with their grandpa. They live with him when their parents disappeared. And that kind of drew from my personal experience as well. Because when I was young, my parents traveled a lot. And I think for a few months, I lived with my grandparents in China. So I was very close to them, and that informed the book a bit. But they didn't mysteriously disappear, though, my parents. Don't worry.
How do you think fantasy helps highlight real life experiences? I'll let whoever wants to answer that go first.
I'll say that, excuse me. I'll say that I think that my favorite thing about writing fantasy, is that it's, how caricature can help enhance the features of somebody, sometimes in ways we don't like, but but that's kind of what the art of caricature is. Sometimes I think fantasy has a similar effect. Not that I think fantasy is a caricature of real life, but that it can become a lens through which we perceive our real life and be like, wow, how does that affect things? How do I feel about that now that I've looked at it this way? Like Lord of the Rings, I think, was a wonderful way of putting a lens on war. I think lots of fantasy books do that, where they put a lens on, in order to emphasize and really explore an aspect of life that you don't want to get muddled and lost in all of the other aspects of life. Whether that's family or friendship or adventure or personal growth or things like that, I think it becomes very effective. I know that in CC, one of the major things, the fantastical things in the story, is that the criaturas all have their souls on the outside of their bodies, and which is how brujas are able to take those and control them for their own power. And CC when she tries to become a bruja to save her sister, has to learn how is she going to handle that, and choosing not to use that level of control, oppression, or unhealthy relationships. And I think that that's one of the major things I wanted to explore, is how would we treat each other if we had access to each other's souls, which to me would be such a beautiful and sacred responsibility of like, if I bear your soul, I want to do well with it. I want to take care of you, but like, not everyone would do that, would they? And it's an interesting lens, I think, to look at real life relationships in, like, because in some level we are all touching each other's souls, and what do we do with that responsibility? And how does that affect power dynamics as a whole, in the society, and on the very intimate level between friends and family? So that's my favorite thing about how fantasy interacts with real life.
That's beautiful and powerful. Anybody else have something to share about?
I think that when you are talking about issues of power, of who has it, who doesn't have it, how do you access your power? How do you recognize what power you hold, even though you don't recognize it as power? When we're talking about issues of how we treat each other in society, how we're governed in the polis, it's just a lot easier to take about 12 steps back and look at it through a completely different frame, a frame that it's almost easier to sit in judgment of it in a way if you don't recognize it as what you see outside your window. And I think that that's an important lesson for kids to learn to embrace, to separate themselves out from day to day, from what's going on and what's happening in the news and what their parents are telling them, or what their teachers are telling them, or what their friends' parents are saying, so that they learn to discern and step back and separate out noise from what they think, what they believe, and what they know to be right.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing, Alyssa, that fantasy allows you to have that distance from these real life issues. Like, you get to just step back and see how events and serious issues could be reinterpreted in a fantastical setting, and that gives you the space to process difficult emotions, especially with kids. I think it makes it more digestible. So, like, for instance, in my book is about it touches on overcoming grief. Like, it's funny and there's a lot of pranks, etc. But at its core, Josephine and her father are stuck in a cycle of grief, and none of the two of them are actually moving towards healing because they refuse to talk and express their emotions. So, it may be a sad commentary if I had a realistic book about it, but if I introduce this vengeful sea creature that forces them to talk about their emotions, that makes it all the more exciting and interesting. So hopefully people will realize you may not have to do something as extreme as meeting a vengeful sea creature, but it is a way of showing how characters can move to a place of healing and peace, using these fantastical elements.
Yeah, building on that, I think that fantasy really does heighten things, and it allows you to strip away a lot of other, especially if you're writing historical, modern, there's so much going on in the world at any one time. But in fantasy, you can really focus on that. It's like, are they going to have their magic? Is the sea witch going to win? And so it really makes the conflict fun at the same time as it makes it really important. And so I think that it's a safe place to explore, because, I don't think most of us in our daily lives are worried about a sea witch taking over our fathers, or evil despots going to hurt our friends and families, or having our souls stolen by a bruja. But at the same time, we all really, we can have fun with it and explore things in a safe way for kids.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've all said. I remember one of my favorite quotes was about how, I forgot who said it, but they said fantasy is not about whether monsters are real, it's about the fact that you can overcome the monsters. And I think, yeah, it's a really good way for children to escape their real world while also learn all these things from a distance, and also up close in a way.
I love that quote. That is great.
I just want to say that's just such a great quote, because it's about learning that you can battle the monsters, whoever the monster is, in your life. It doesn't have to be the people who rule your kingdom, right? Or spirits or sea witches. It's, it could
Yeah,
be the bully
exactly.
next door. Yeah, that's beautiful.
So, what ways I know Alyssa Coleman, you hinted at researching with Khan Academy and getting to know your readers that way. So when you write for middle grade, how do you make sure that the readers can connect to your stories? What is something that you do to make sure that they're drawn in and feel what you want them to feel? I'll just let whoever jump in. Oh, Alyssa.
I'll jump in and build on that. I love to step back and really think about how I felt. And I also like to make sure that I'm looking at adults as different than how I felt, because I know that adults felt very different when I was in middle school. So like in one of the first scenes of the book, Emma's really excited to take a tour of the school, and instead the headmistress offers her father tea, and she's like, why do adults like having long conversations over hot beverages? Because to a kid, I remember thinking like, can we please just get on with this? Where my mom wanted to sit and have coffee. So I try to really put myself back in my old shoes and think about how the world felt and looked at that time.
I would agree with that. I think that's one of the most helpful things for me, is just going back there. And fortunately, I have the fortunate experience of having been a writer even at that age, so I can go back to my old writing sometimes and just be like, oh, so this is where I was, but also stepping back into that, because on some level, I think I'm still there. Somewhere deep inside, I'm still 12. Just in the lovely cast of an adult. I think that really helps a lot, being able to go back to those things. And fortunately, I've had nephews who were that age. They're not anymore, unfortunately. They insist on growing up. But for a while there, they were all spanning like 5 of them perfectly. Every time one grew up a little bit, there was another one in that age. And I was like, perfect. And I used to sit there and tell them stories and experiment on like the things that made them excited, the things that they were like, yes, I want that. And be like, yeah, that's right, because that's what I wanted too. Okay, I can still remember, So I think that staying in touch with that child inside of you and that childhood experience, I think it actually enhances empathy, just generally speaking. But I also think it helps readers connect to your stories then, because you're empathizing with that experience with them.
I think, when my kids were that age, it was great because I could spy on them and their friends, and I could, really kind of draw from them. But they've outgrown that. But I think too, yes, drawing on what that felt like, it's not a raw experience, but it's a moment in time that lives very strongly in my mind. But I think also keeping in mind always that, for me, this sort of 10 to 12 to 13-year-old age is this moment where you're starting to understand an awful lot about the world. You're starting to really key into what's going on, and that maybe everybody out there doesn't actually know. They don't have all the answers. And that's scary, and it's also incredibly invigorating and empowering. And I think I just always try to hold on to sort of that like knife's edge moment where you know more than when you were a kid, but hopefully you haven't given over to sort of the world weariness of teenagedom. And so I think that's what I hold on to most tightly when I'm writing middle grade.
Yeah, Alyssa, I think one of the things that I do is I try to create characters that I think kids would relate to, or I try to think about who I would have wanted to be at that age, because, I try to create my dream character. And then I also try to look at the adults around me through the kids' eyes, because I find that at that age, kids are questioning things that adults do. As you said, that they seem rather silly, and they don't quite understand the rules of society as yet. So I do like to use that to do some type of social commentary on things that may be a little ridiculous, or traditions that we have that we still partake in, even though they may not make sense. And so that brings in some humor, I think, for kids as well, because you are seeing things that they may have taught but know that they're not allowed to say. So yeah, it's just about trying to interpret events through the eyes of an 11-year-old, and then creating characters that are able to express themselves in a way that kids wish that they could have.
Yeah, you just described my narrative style. I love looking at from the viewpoint of a kid and commenting on kind of sometimes how silly the adults are acting, and then pointing out like flaws in society that way. Another method I like to use is I love food. So as a kid, I remember some of my favorite quotes from books were about the food. So like in Chronicles of Narnia, the Turkish delights, that always sticks in my mind. So in the Dreamweavers, I use a lot of food to basically draw out the story. So there's mooncakes, which are these round traditional pastries that have filling, and you eat them on the Mid-Autumn Festival in China. Yeah, I think it's like the universal language kind of food.
These are all really good points. So we want to thank everyone for joining us on the Middle Ground Book Fest this year. And we all hope that you heard about some amazing books. And if you are interested in purchasing any of these wonderful fantasy novels, they are linked in the description below. Yes, let's get some book love. There, look at those covers. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope that you have a fantastic day. Bye.